Hey guys, welcome to Houdini Houdono. This is Ronald speaking and we're on Season 2, Episode 3. In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to use custom attributes to control your simulation, just like the one you see on the screen now. This is quite a popular post on Instagram. I'm guessing that a lot of you want to know how to use custom attributes in Houdini to drive your simulations. So this is the video for this, and as promised in this series, I'm going to cover a little bit about how to go from your native software. In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to bring some objects from Blender into Houdini. So we're going to use the Blender monkey model called Suzanne and bring it to Houdini, and I'm going to discuss some of the differences over there. The lesson plan is as such. 1, I'm going to show you guys how to go from Houdini to Blender, and 2, I'm going to show you guys how to make a custom infection solver spreading so that we can get a custom falloff over time, an attribute that runs from, say, the nose of the monkey all the way to the whole piece of geometry, and 3rd, how to use this custom attribute to drive the simulation. Okay, so let's discuss in detail what the plan is. First, exporting and importing geometries, right? So the legacy ways of exporting and importing is .obj files. This is a very common one. And the other very common one is Alembic files, which tends to hold a little bit more information than OBJs. Also, there is FBX, which is very good for game engines, and usually there might be some scale issues just because it's for games. Finally, there are other kinds of ways to export and import geometries into Houdini, which I might discuss. And once we get the geometry into Houdini, we'll learn to do the spread falloff. There are many ways to do custom falloff attributes in Houdini, and I found a very organic way is to use the Pyro Source Spread, which, as the name suggests, it was designed for pyro simulations like the fire and smoke stuff in Houdini, but we can use it to just create some very organic custom attributes that can look really nice. So how it works is, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to draw a sphere, okay? How it works is, there's a sphere, we pick a start point, and we define its temperature to be a value of 1, and with that we can then run the solver, and then the solver will basically, after going through some settings, will spread across the surface like that. So it will then over time spread across the whole surface like this. So it will be basically this. With that, we can use it to drive the simulation. Okay, so we'll store it into maybe a custom attribute called falloff, and then we also will remap this attribute as simulation falloff for some simulation settings. And then we'll store this into a little null, and nulls are in this X shape in Houdini. I'll call it a reference for the falloff, okay? And so 3rd, we'll define this object here as a Vellum soft body using the struts configuration, and then we'll put it into the Vellum solver. So how struts works is it will create some custom constraints over here that draws across geometry, and they will be basically recorded as a certain length in a world scale depending on how big a geometry is. But this length, Houdini recognizes it as rest length. It defaults to a scale of 1. Regardless of how long it is, it will register its default rest length scale of 1. So if we were to attempt to grow the object using the Vellum solver, what we can do is to say that over time, right, let's change it to 2. And so we have a sphere, and then in order to get to twice the size, we just need to say rest length grow by 2 times 2. It's just that this will make the whole object expand uniformly, and that is not very interesting. And the objective of this lesson is to use our custom falloff attribute. So as it spreads, it grows, right? So if I draw over this over here, as this gets a value of 1, it grows bigger, right? Until it overall grows bigger like this. And I mentioned that we might create our own simulation falloff, and the reason for that is the falloff attributes are usually prepared in the value of 0 and 1. So it starts off majority 0, and then after it's finished spreading, it's fully at 1. However, our rest length scale should default to 1 because everything multiplied by 1 remains a scale of 1, so there's no change. So we basically want to remap what was 0 to 1 to 1 to 2 so that we can use this to drive the rest length scale. And don't worry if this doesn't make sense now. I will show you guys in Houdini in a little bit, and hopefully it all makes sense over there. So why do we prepare a separate sim falloff versus the falloff attribute? Well, that's because we can now use the falloff attribute to drive the shading. This little pighead over here starts off as a little jello-like substance. After it's gotten the falloff, it goes to a value of 1. So we can use this method to drive the shading. Okay, now that the theory is out of the way, we are in Blender now, and I'm going to show you how to bring some objects over from Blender to Houdini. right? So let's go to File and New Scene, General, and don't save, and that's where we have the cube here. So I'm gonna just toss the cube, hit delete, and hit Shift A, go to Mesh and choose Monkey, and we have created an object called Suzanne. Let me select it, frame it. So this is our model that we're gonna use today. So with that selected, firstly I'm going to save my Blender file. It's a .blend file, save as .blend. Now I'm going to export the object in various formats for us to bring into Houdini. With the object selected, I'm going to go to File, Export as an ABC, and just going to repeat that, Export OBJ, File, Export FBX, and File, Export GLTF. So here we are in Houdini, and there's an empty setup geometry node here called setup, and there are just a couple of camera nodes. And let me dive into the geometry setup here and drop down a file node. So this node allows us to bring in geometry from other pieces of software that has been exported. And here it defaults to default.bgeo, which is Houdini's native file format to store geometry data. And we can click on this file browsing icon here and paste the directory where we exported our files. So you can see here we exported 4 files, but we can see 3 of them that are supported with the file node here. So the first one being ABC, and here we can see that we have brought in the geometry. I'll just make a copy of it. FBX, which we notice it to be slightly bigger, so I've mentioned that there might be some scale issues. And not to worry, if I drop down a transform node and I'll template my ABC format, and if I transform down by 100.01, we can see that it's the same size, so it's just 100th of the scale. It's 100 times the scale, so we have to make it 100th of the scale to make it work. As we would expect for it to be the exact same units as in Blender. So you can see in Blender 01 is here, and in Houdini 01 is also here. Next one, it's file, another file node, and let's pick up the OBJ object, and we can see that it's very similar. So ABC is here, FBX is here, and OBJ is here. Well, the difference is on the ABC, there doesn't seem to be UVs, and that's because if we hit middle mouse on the node, we see that it's all packed geometry. So we have to unpack it by dropping down a convert node, and with that, it's been unpacked, and we can use the geometry as however we would like to use. So here are 3 ways to bring in geometry, and there's a last one, which we exported the GLTF file. You might have downloaded some assets from the internet that's GLTF. Houdini has got you covered, so you just drop down a GLTF node, and that's where we can click this button and also bring in the GLB file, and there we have it. So Houdini supports all popular and common file formats, even your STLs and everything, so that's how you bring files from your native software. So that part is done, and I'm going to show you guys how to set up the setup that we saw at the start of this video. So I'm going to use the OBJ version of this, just call it file OBJ. And it has UVs, but I'm going to check this visualizer off so that I don't have to see it. And I'm going to drop down a transform node to rotate this so that it's level to the ground. And speaking of level to the ground, I'm just going to drop the match size and changing justify Y to minimum so that it automatically sits on the ground. And I'm going to change my transform X to -36, which is a value that I tested earlier that sits nicely onto the ground. Just for fun, you can just keep rotating this and it will always place things onto the ground. So that is what this match size node does. Put things onto the ground. Okay, so with that done, I'm just gonna check off the grid and subdivide this geometry once. Subdivide. And the normals are messed up here, so the display is not good. So let me drop down a new normal node. So that resets the normals. And I'm just going to create a Vellum configure struts, soft body, and a Vellum solver. And I'm going to change the entire frame range to 1 to 100. Turn on the real-time toggle where I'm circling now at the bottom left hand of the screen. Go to the first frame by hitting Ctrl up and hit up for it to simulate. And that's where we get our geometry simulated. And we do want it to be on the ground, so let me turn on the ground position. With the Vellum solver selected, there are some simulation attributes here, and I turn on the ground position. And if I simulate that now, you can see it hit the ground like that. So now I do understand that the Vellum struts is set up to be a little bit too soft. So let me go to the stretch constraint here and choose 1000. And so it's a little bit tougher. Just as personal preference, when we check on the ground plane, this blue grid turns on. I'm just going to go to the Visualize tab here and turn off Show Collision, because I already know that I set up a ground plane, so I don't need to see it. It's kind of distracting. And I also noticed that the eyes flop out here, because in Blender, this has been prepared as separate objects, and I didn't fuse it in Blender. So let's do a slight detour in Houdini to learn how to patch things up a little bit. So you can skip past this modeling segment if you're not looking for this, because that's not the point of this exercise at all. But what I'm going to do is to try to fuse the eyes to the eye sockets. So just give me a moment here. If I hit W, I can see slightly better what I'm looking at. If I hit S, this appears, and I hit the edge selection, this appears to be the eyes, and this appears to be the eye sockets. So I think I just want to merge them all into one geometry, and to do that I'm just going to go before the subdivision and work from there so that I have less to deal with, and double click selection of these two edges, and right click and convert selection to primitive selection, Ctrl Shift 4, and hit delete, so that removes the faces. Next, I'm just gonna hit S again and use my primitive selection, double click the eyes and hit tab and type in subdivide. So I subdivide only the eyes so that the resolution of the eyes matches closer to the eye socket, and hit S once more and select these edges of my eyes and hit tab and group them up into an edge selection called eye edges. Sorry, let me give some space over here. And next I'm just gonna hit S once more and select the actual eyelids. I believe it's this one's. It's quite hard to see. Yeah, but this is the actual eyelids, and hit tab and another group node, and this shall be called eyelid edges. So I have two groups now. One is for the eyes and one is for the eyelids, and I'm gonna attempt to fuse them. So to fuse stuff in Houdini, just drop down a fuse node, and it appears to look for points to fuse, and so I have to promote these two edge groups to point groups. So group promote. The default is to convert from auto to points, so it will detect for me based on my selection over here. So eye edges and eyelid edges has been promoted to point groups, and on my fuse node I can choose my source group to be eye edges and the target group to be eyelid edges. And then I can increase my snap distance so that my eyelids snap to my eyes. Something close like this will be enough. Obviously it wouldn't match entirely because my topology is different. And we are done with this little quick fix. You can do this in your native software probably, but if you're lazy like me, this will do the job. So there's a hole somewhere in there, but for the purposes of this exercise, I'm just going to continue. Let's learn how to do the infection solver. So this is part 2. We need to determine the start point and use the Pyro Source Spread to spread it across the surface. Right, to determine the start point, let's hit S and just use the point selection and select, say, the tip of this nose, hit tab and just group as usual and just call it start. Right, so this is my start point. Let me just drop down a Pyro Source Spread. So this node is a simulation node which allows us to create some Pyro Source simulation, but there is no temperature attribute on this, so nothing will happen. To define a temperature attribute, we'll give this little point here a temperature attribute of 1. So let me drop down a point wrangle, and for the point in start, which is just the one point that we selected, we'll just set the temperature attribute to be 1. So set temp. And so on my Pyro Source Spread now, if I visualize my temperature attribute over here, just go Ctrl 1 and hit up, and we can see that the temperature is not spreading. That's because the cooling rate by default is quite high, so I'm just gonna halve it. So slight difference, let me halve it once more, and I can see it spreading very slightly. Let me halve it once more, and I can see it spreading slightly more. Maybe have it once more. Okay, that's not really helping. I can see a little bit more now, and I'm just gonna increase my diffusion rate to 2. So that's diffusing a little bit too fast, so that didn't combust and catch on quote-unquote fire. So let me change the diffusion rate back to 1, and under combustion I'm gonna lower my ignition temperature to 0.1. So right now it ignites because I lowered the threshold for what can ignite, but it seems to spread only to a maximum of these edges here. That's because there's a limit to how much this temperature can spread across, because under temperature change there's a surge radius limit of 0.1 and this edge length is longer than 0.1. So let me fix that by hitting 0.2. So let's see if it spreads all the way through the geometry now. Almost there, maybe 0.25. And now it spreads almost there. Oh no, now it goes across the whole geometry at 0.25. For now, it's looking a little bit slow because it finishes the transformation at frame 70. I want it a little bit faster, so let me increase the rate to 2. And lower the combustion 0.05. Yeah, so that's a little bit faster. Maybe 1.25 as the rate. Maybe back to 1 because I lowered my ignition. Yeah, so that feels not bad. Maybe increase my ignition threshold by a tiny bit. Yeah, so around there. I want it to finish at around frame 50. So that's cool, and this is my temperature attribute. The shape of the dispersion, my max neighbors is 25. If I want more intricate patterns, I can lower this by half to 12. It maybe makes it a little bit more intricate over time, like that. Let's just go for that max much lower, like 3. So each time it can only catch 3 neighbors. So this way it might spread a little bit more carefully, and this might give you different results that you might be looking for. So for now, I would like this to be, say, a value of 10. I think I don't need it to be too slow. Maybe 8. I still want it to finish by frame 50, thereabouts. Yeah, so maybe 9. 10 I think is good. Okay, so this is my temperature attribute, and let me just hop over to the geometry spreadsheet and type in here temperature to see what the actual values are. So it's actually going from a value of 0 all the way up to 9.6. And so interestingly, that's what the Pyro Source Spread does. It starts with 1, but it pushes it to 10. And so I'm just going to drop down an attribute remap, because I want to remap my temperature attribute to my Falloff attribute, which I can use for my shading. So just to be clear, I'm going to use Falloff for the shading, and I'm going to use sim Falloff for the simulations Falloff. Okay, so I'm just going to hit compute range here, and it detects that it ranges up to 10 for my input max. So I'm going to say what was 0 to 10 will be now 0 to 1. So my Falloff attribute is all 0 over here and 1 over here. Okay, that's my Falloff attribute. So this attribute remap for my shadings Falloff, and I would like another one. This is for my simulation Falloff, and so in here I'm just going to change this to sim Falloff. These are my simulation attributes, and I'm going to create a null node and type here ref sim Falloff. Okay, so this contains my sim Falloff, and inside my Vellum solver, let's learn how to grow this object. Remember in the theory earlier, if I increase my rest length of my struts constraint, it will basically grow twice the length if I increase it twice. So let's test this theory. Under Vellum struts, if I change my rest length scale at the start, so in 1 frame it will attempt to go to a value of 2, which will make it pop to a bigger version of itself, like that. But it needs the cloth constraint to do the same. So if I both set to 2, you can see it grow like that. Okay, so but that's not what we want. We want it to grow over time. So let me just hop back to the struts constraint and change it back to 1, so back at default. I was just trying to demonstrate which is the parameter that we want to adjust, which is the rest length scale. So I'm just going to dive in now, and I just want to animate this over time instead of establishing at the start that it's going to just balloon to twice the length uniformly. So in here I can drop down the Vellum configure properties node and plug it into the source here. And in here, you can see that I can turn on rest length scale. And if I turn off this computational dynamics brain, go to the first frame, alt click in there and say up to frame 50. And I say, let's size it up to 3. And just turn on the brain, go to the first frame and simulate. Then we'll get a similar effect. You can see it grows up to 3 as expected. Okay, but as you can see, it's very boring. It goes up here, and we want to use our custom attribute to do this. So it all works. Let me turn off the brain again, remove all this animation, and instead we will check here, use Vexpression. And to use this Vexpression, we will need to know the name of the parameter to type in code, and we can find that out by hovering over here and see that the parameter is called rest scale. So if we equate rest scale to rest scale, let me just turn on the brain to run the simulation. These will essentially be the same thing. Go to the first frame and I say rest scale equals to rest scale times 3. Then it will boom bigger like that. Okay, so that's all still working. And so this is a part that gets a little bit tricky, because here's where I want to bring in my Falloff attribute, right? And to bring that in, I have to use a function called point, and it takes 3 pieces of information. One is my geometry stream, next is my attribute name, and thirdly is my point number. So the first one is my geometry stream. I've got to bring it in with one of the inputs on this third tab here. And let's look up for free slot. So input 1 is myself. Let's not mess with that one. Input 2 is dot data and it's been set to the geometry data. So let's also not mess with that one. And input 3 is none. So let's use this empty slot and choose SOP. And I'm just going to copy over my reference sim Falloff here into my solver SOP path, input 3 here. So as much as this input 3 is actually the geometry stream 2, so because the computer starts counting from 0, so input 1 is 0, input 2 is 1, and input 3 is 2. Okay, so point, and the input is 2, and the attribute I want is called sim Falloff, and my reference point is just use the point number, pt num, and the line with a semicolon. And let's go to the first frame and simulate this. It's strings and it's very laggy because it entirely collapses. That's because the sim Falloff attribute that we are bringing in here, it's still 0 on the first frame. It hasn't grown. So when the rest length is 0, the entire geometry will collapse. So we need to start from 1 and we need to end with 2 or 3, right? So we're remapping what was 0 to 10 to 1 to 2. Okay, let's jump in here and run the simulation again. So you can see now it grows as we would expect. Okay. I don't like the preview of the first frame being stuck there. So let me just drop down an attribute copy to copy over. So as much as this ref says sim Falloff, it also has the Falloff attribute, which we're using for shading. So let me just copy over the Falloff attribute. And my visualizer should then be the Falloff attribute, which has not been set up. And to quickly set up the Falloff attribute visualizer, click on this eye icon, find Falloff, just click on it and it will visualize the Falloff attribute for you. Okay, and this is it's okay, it's just slightly lacking a little bit of energy. So what I'm gonna do is for both this Falloff ramps, I'm just gonna select both handles and change it to B-spline and just give it more contrast. Sorry, let's do that for both. Just give it more contrast for both. Let's see what this looks like. So quite a bit more energetic. Cool. So making a contrast curve on the attributes results in a different simulation like that. And I'm just going to drop down subdivision node so that we can subdivide this on before we render this. So just once, and maybe drop down a null node and call it out morph. So I'm going to color this green out of habit and just arrange my node tree. So one straight line here. Just color this reference blue, also out of habit. So let me select my alt morph node, jump outside, create a new geo node, call it morph. This is my actual rendering geometry container. Dive inside, drop down an object merge, and paste that null over here so that references the geometry like that. Jump outside again, turn off my visualizer, and we can see the geometry just moves like that. Let me create a backdrop now. So let me drop down a grid and give it some UVs, UV texture, put my display flag on UV texture, and make 2 more copies for the side wall and the back wall. Rotate this 90 degrees and the other one 90 degrees on these 2 sides, and move this back a little bit on the x-axis by 5 units and the other one back by 5 units. And that's how we get a little backdrop here. And let's just maximize the height of the walls. Maybe for both of them, let's go up by 2 units. Yeah, so let me now switch to my render cam and hit the padlock sign so that ties my render cam to my viewport, and with the morph node selected, spacebar F to frame it, and that's how I can frame my geometry like this. So unfortunately it seems to be pointing to the back. That's unfortunate, so let me rotate this by 90 degrees so it faces here and it jumps and it faces here. That's pretty cool. Okay, and I'm gonna change my camera lens to 120 focal length and frame my morph. So this is my end frame, and I'm gonna set a key on my rotations here, and on my start frame I'm just gonna scoot and rotate my camera angle over, something like this, and rotate it downwards, something like this. Keep it center of the frame, and alt click on the entire rotation parameter so that we animate something like that. Perhaps I can go to frame 50, just compensate this slightly to the right, like that. So it doesn't have to be perfect, we can get some organic offsets. That will be fine. Just catching up with the geometry here. That's cool. Next, I'm going to show you guys how to drive the shading with the attribute. So let me hop over to the material context and create a redshift material builder node. And we're going to create two, one for the morph object and the other one for the background. So background, let's do a material assignment by dragging and dropping onto the objects. And now that's done. Let's hit save. Now that I've saved the file, let's create a light, redshift light dome, and pick an HDRI. I'll pick one that I always use, and turn off the viewport enable and turn off the environment because I don't want to see it. And make sure the color space is set to scene linear rec 709-sRGB. And you might still see this error, and that's just because when we first picked the file, the color space was not available. So to remove the error, what I like to do is just delete the node and undo, and the error is gone. And just gonna turn off my padlock so that I don't accidentally move my camera. And just gonna go to frame 100 and just scrub along. And it's all good, but I wish to get a little bit of an organic camera move on my null over here. So let me right click on the null's translate parameter, go to motion effects and choose noise. And the default is quite crazy, so this is what the noise is. Let me change the amplitude to 1 and the period to 3, maybe 2, and the harmonics to 2. So that's quite an organic motion, and I'm gonna keep that. But this framing is slightly tight over here, so I'm going to change my render cam's focal length to 100, just so everything is kept in frame, something like this. Yeah, and maybe let me just compensate the rotations once more, because after the noise node, the framing is slightly off. And maybe just make my grids just slightly bigger, 1.1. Okay, great. So maybe at the start, this angle should be angled downwards more. Just refining my camera animation. Should take a while before it compensates to go upwards. Cool. Okay, let's just check the lighting. Go over to the redshift render view and kick off the render. So it's not looking too bad. I'm just gonna rotate the light slightly so that it half cuts the geometry like that. Pretty interesting. Yep, maybe just slightly will do. Yep. Okay, and let me just shade the background first. There shall be a piece of concrete. And drop down the redshift texture node and pick up the concrete. So there's a base color concrete here. We just drop that in, stop and start the render, and we can see our concrete in the background. And this is sRGB, that's correct for base color, but I'm just going to drop a new one for the normals. And let me pick up the normals. And this has to be set to raw. Use a bump node to interpret this as tangent space normal and plug it into the bump map. That's where we get the bump. And finally, the roughness. Roughness should also be set to raw, and just plug it into the materials reflection roughness. So I hit L to kind of like lay everything out. And let me just show you that even with no base color texture, the normal map is there and the roughness is also there. So that's good to verify that. And we can now do the materials for our subject matter. So here, this one I shall create a clay material, and another one shall be a metallic gold material. So just conceptually, they are very different types of materials. So let me choose a gold preset for gold and a clay preset for clay. So clay looks like this. I have some subsurface scattering inside this clay. So I'm just gonna turn it on fully, not use the diffuse at all. And just lower the scale significantly, like 0.1, and increase my samples to 2048. So here's the gold. It's very clean. I would like to have some normals, so RS texture, and I'm going to source for some carbon fiber looking texture. And this is the normal node, so I'm just going to set it to raw. Once again, drop down the bump map, change it to tangent space normal, and plug it into bump map. So restart the render, and we can see it now. Maybe turn up the height scale to say 5, so for a way more pronounced, over-pronounced effect, if you will. And on here, on the texture, I'm just going to scale it by 2. So I get a bit more tessellation going on, so that looks cool. Just get it a little bit more like rose gold, something like that. Okay, so let's design the clay now. Well, before designing the clay, let me show you guys how to switch the materials around. So the way to do it is to drop down a material blender, redshift material blender, and basically this hosts the base material and any other materials that come through, and then you can use a custom attribute to display either the base material or layer 1, or so on and so forth. So let me drop down a redshift point attribute node. Once you create a node, it's called particle attribute lookup, and the attribute we want to look for is Falloff. right? Not sim falloff, because that one is for simulation. Falloff is ranged from 0 to 1, and I can preview this by dropping it to surface here, restart the render, and I can see that if I scrub my timeline, you can see the attribute go from 0 to 1. So if I plug my material blender in, plug my gold into layer 1's layer color, and you can see this blend color here. If it's on 0, it's the base material, which is clay. If it's on 1, then it's gold. Right, so basically I can slide from 0 to 1, but instead of that, I'm just going to use my Falloff attribute. So I'm just going to plug out color into blend color here. So if I scrub now, I can see my clay material at the start morphing into the gold material. Cool, so that is that, and I'm just gonna color my gold material all bright yellow, so I understand that that's the second material. And this texture sampler on this bump map is also yellow because that's for my second material. And for my first material, maybe I just color it blue. And for the neutral node, which holds the transition attribute, that I'm going to leave it as the default, so it's clear for me. So this blender, I will have to do the same blending. If not, on my clay, I can see that I'm getting the bumps, which I don't want. So let me also do a bump blender. And for my clay, I would like some displacement on my clay. So there's also a displacement blender. So there's a material blender, a bump blender, and the displacement blender. And in this case, I would like a procedural texture, redshift max on noise, change it to stipple, put it in base, and drop down displacement node. Let's hop outside, stop the render, save the file, and go to my Morph geometry node. Head over to the Redshift OBJ tab under tessellation, turn on tessellation, and enable displacement. So with that, my displacement should be really large, and let me just scale down the displacement here to 0.1. Just frame it like that. So this looks like clay, but I need it to not happen on the metal. So to do that, I need the blend attribute to go to layer 1's displacement weight, which will then isolate base displacement to the base node. Okay, so this is for the clay, so it's blue. That's for the carbon fiber texture for the gold. And let me now design my displacement. I don't want it to be too strong, so 0.05. And the scale of this, I would like this to be, say, 2. And just go to the first frame to see. That's looking okay. I'll use the isolate select mode and just change the low clip for my texture to 0.1. Perhaps pull my contrast a little bit higher. Just displace it a lot lesser, 0.025. Yeah, maybe something like that is okay. I'm gonna change my orientation of my geometry a little bit. Just adjusting my camera animation so that it's just not too happy with the composition. So something like this is pretty alright. Just gonna make the background slightly darker. Maybe I'll just lower my light. Let's check my light source using the clay mode. It's slightly bright, so maybe -1 is better. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. And I'm just gonna add some camera defocus. So let me turn on the camera settings here. Go to optical, turn on bokeh, and alt click, and just use the click to focus tool and click on the face. That sets my camera focus distance to 17.5. Let me set a keyframe on that, and then go to the first frame. Use my click to focus tool, click on the geometry, that's 16.9. Let me also alt click on that. So here I can ensure that my focus is mostly in focus, and maybe there's some organic offset. And I'm just gonna drop down my aperture to 1 so that it's shot very shallow, get some nice blur. You know, because they are both warm tones, when the transition happens, it's not the most exciting. So I'm just gonna try perhaps use not a warm clay color, maybe purple. It's odd, but the contrast is better, so I'm gonna go with this. Let me see if I can play with my camera focal length in the animation. So when it gets bigger, maybe it zooms out. So let me just reframe my camera to more like that. I'll click in there, and perhaps I need a bigger ground. So 1.25. Just make sure that the lights still look okay. What I'll do is to go to my focal length there. It's at 100 now. I will make sure it starts moving because it moves outwards. So the cameraman might on frame 33 decide to turn the focal length more zoomed out. So let me alt click there and hit a frame, say like that, across say 20 frames, 80 focal length, maybe 90. And I need my grid to be slightly bigger. So my focal length was probably a little bit more zoomed in here. So on 33 it's 100, maybe 120, maybe 140 at the start. And let me just reduce it slightly. Yep, okay. I think we'll like the focal length to be a bit more obvious, more like a decided change. Maybe we can have a bounce factor, goes back. Okay, so I'm just gonna head back to play with the simulation attributes here. Maybe my struts can be less tough. Maybe it's just not 1000 but 100. Let's see how that works. Okay, that's pretty interesting. But I think I'll go for 500. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Let me just reframe my camera once more. So it starts here, it ends here, and in the middle somewhere. Yep, that's fine. Okay. Also for my clay, it's a slightly shiny clay. It's for more contrast with the gold. Maybe I can make it very rough clay so that there's more contrast. Overall, the shot looks a little bit tight, so I'm just gonna zoom out a little bit. So what you see on the screen now is the result, guys. I hope you enjoyed creating this setup, and here's what we covered today. Number one, we covered how to import and export objects from Blender into Houdini, and we explored a few file formats, the OBJ, the ABC, and the FBX, and even the GLTF. And we also explored the technique of how to do a custom spread source attribute using the Pyro Source Spread. And also we then learned how to grow a Vellum soft body and the concept of using the rest length scale on the constraint properties. And we learned the crux of this tutorial, how to use a custom Falloff attribute to drive that simulation. So these are pretty intermediate techniques, and I'm very happy for you to have sat through this video. And the other one that I think it's pretty high in demand is this one where people are asking how I create this cloth weave. It's a pretty classic effect, but maybe there are not too many resources out there on how to achieve something like that highly detailed. And perhaps I'm going to show you guys how to create this very cool metal flicks effect. This looks really complicated, as if there's a fluid sim. It's actually more straightforward than we think it is, so I'm just also going to include that in this series. I hope you guys enjoyed yourselves watching this tutorial and following along. I'm just going to annotate all the working file that we have gone through so far. Once again, this is Ronald speaking, and I'll see you guys. Bye bye.